you will find many people, especially on the political right and in the political center, who will embrace the idea of authoritarianism. And the idea is that Trump or Orban or any of these other regimes, they're not fascist, they're authoritarian. And authoritarian is sort of a way of saying, sure, they don't like democracy, sure, they embrace military power, but they're not as bad as those Nazis or those fascists. They're different. Now, anybody who sort of talks about this as authoritarianism, in some ways is kind of engaging in a practice of gaslighting. Because authoritarianism really is popularized in the 1970s and the 1980s by the American political and intellectual right.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy at the Broadbent Institute. In September 2025, the Broadbent Institute joined left-wing think tanks from Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Uruguay, and Spain to support the establishment of a global network of think tanks that produce rigorous analysis, foster data-driven debate, and contribute to the search for proposals in defense of democracy. In the declarative agreement behind the establishment of the new Red Internacional de Pensamiento, Democratico, or International Network of Democratic Thought, progressive civil society groups acknowledge that although the new radical right is heterogeneous and shifting at the local level, it is rapidly expanding its ideas elsewhere, undermining the institutional foundations of representative democracy. While viewing the democratic regime as an obstacle to progress, the far right promotes climate and pandemic denialism, delegitimizes the struggle for women's equality, fosters the rejection of and hatred for immigration and asylum seekers, and upholds economic nationalism as a supreme value. This far-right surge has politically taken the form of fascism, an authoritarian and nationalist political ideology that has undermined democracy around the world. But what is fascism exactly? Here's Broadbent Research Fellow and labor historian Jon Weier of George Brown College to help us define fascist ideology and what this means for Canada. Here's a recording of his lecture on fascism, presented by the Perspectives Journal podcast.
In the public forum right now, there's a lot of discussion of fascism. And the reason we're talking about fascism, really in a way that we haven't really discussed it since the Second World War, is that the question is, are there governments that are getting elected and taking power around the world, in Europe, in Asia, in the United States, that are fascist governments? And the only reason there's a debate is because there are a lot of people on the political left and in the political center who want to minimize the fascist nature of these regimes. They want to be able to do that in order to be able to continue to work with these governments, these regimes, in the maintenance of the capitalist global order. There's always more of a comfort on the part of conservative liberals in working with fascists than with the anti-capitalist or anti-fascist left, because fascism always includes the maintenance of existing economic hierarchies and capitalist economic systems. So the next question, and this is really the question we've been asking the last couple of weeks, is Donald Trump a fascist? And there is some debate. Generally, historians of fascism are pretty clear. Clearly, the Republican Party has been taken over by the extreme right. That extreme right really has taken on a number of the characteristics of a fascist party, and Donald Trump is pushing that party into embracing even more of those tenets of fascism. There are a lot of people, though, in Canada, in the United States, more broadly, who really resisted calling what's happening in the United States fascism. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And what they do instead is they talk about it in terms of populism or authoritarianism or far-right conservatism. But those are all sort of catchwords, easy ways or ways to talk about fascism without saying fascism. Because the moment you say fascism, you have to then start asking the question, can you still work with these governments? Can you be an ally of these governments? Do you have to then rethink your fundamental relationship to them? And that's always a question that governments, that politicians, especially those who are embedded in and committed to the capitalist order, don't want to ask. And so that's the question. In my mind, Donald Trump is a fascist, Viktor Orban is a fascist, and fascism really has taken a place it hasn't had since the 1940s on the global stage. So what then is fascism? The term fascism refers to a symbol of Roman imperial authority called the fasces, which is a bundle of sticks tied around an axe. And this is actually a symbol that was taken on in a lot of different parts of the world, especially in the 19th century, associated with republican traditions that harken back to imperial Rome. So, for example, the fasci as a symbol appears in a number of American seals and displays. For example, the seal of the United States Senate includes cross fasces below the American flag. And so it's really become this seal for a long time associated with republicanism and the Roman political tradition. Where the fasces become associated with fascism and where they give their name to fascism is in the Italian National Fascist Party of Benito Mussolini. They adopted many of the trappings of imperial Rome. They took on especially the symbol of authority and force, the fasces, and they took their name from the fasces to create the idea of the fascist party. Now, when we talk about fascist parties today, we generally refer, for example, not only to Italian fascism, but to German National Socialism, to Francoist Phalangism in Spain from the 1930s to the 1970s. And so it's become a catch-all term. But really, originally, it only referred to the Italian Fascist Party, and other fascist parties that came to power in that same system always referred to themselves by their own national titles. Now, that's one of the challenges. People who are very specific, who are looking to minimize fascism, who are looking to minimize whether these new political parties are fascist or not, always try to find the most specific definition. A fascist party is this. Usually the definition refers very, very concretely and explicitly either to Italian fascism or to the German Nationalist Socialist Party of 1933 to 1945. But here are some basic ideas, and I think as we go through these, you'll really see that a lot of these extreme right-wing parties today in the 21st century take on these characteristics of fascism. So it's important to remember, for example, that fascism is a process rather than an ideology, right? It's not like communism. Communism is an ideology. You can go back to the original works of Marx, you can go back to the original works of Lenin, and you sort of have this ideological basis for the state system that's created out of the communist revolution. This doesn't exist for fascism. There's no ideology. In every country, the thinkers, the ideas of fascism are different. They pull on specific national traditions. They refer to specific national issues. And so there's no kind of universalist ideology like Marxism to refer to when you talk about fascism. Similarly, ideological convictions are often very, very flexible. They can change over time. They can adapt to new situations. The main objective is nothing more than the seizure of absolute power and the transformation of society. It always emerges from a moment of crisis. So, of course, in the 1920s and the 1930s, it emerges from the crisis of the post-First World War era and the Great Depression. In the 21st century, it emerges from the crisis of late-stage capitalism and growing inequality. It always begins as a mass movement. It always is characterized by a rejection of communism, liberalism, and even mainstream conservatism, which is why it's always so surprising that liberals and conservatives are often willing to work with fascists, at least until they go too far in one way or another. It's motivated towards national regeneration, so it's important to remember that every fascist movement is always a nationalist one. You can have fascists in the United States going to Hungary, learning from fascists there, building ties, but fascists are always bounded by national ideas and national identities. And it involves the regeneration of a people, an ethnically divine people, often in response to a plot or traitors or some nefarious group who are trying to pull down that existing ethnic society. Often it targets Jews. They've been the traditional targets of fascists. Anti-Semitism is a huge part of it, but it can also be immigrants. It also can be members of the LGBTQ community, feminists, women, socialists, doesn't matter. There's always an other that's targeted and blamed for the malaise that's affecting that national society. It's built through dictatorship or an authoritarian state. There is no place for democratic debate or engagement in a fascist society, and it always believes in the legitimacy of force and violence in creating that new state. That's kind of the general idea. And I'm now going to sort of talk about three sort of ideas of what fascism is, really going from kind of the most specific to the most expansive. And the first is this really well-known American historian, a historian actually of the Vichy French regime and authoritarianism and fascism during the Second World War, Robert Paxton. And in his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, he talks about fascism as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. In How Fascism Works, American philosopher Jason Stanley defines fascism as a cult of the leader who promises national restoration in the face of humiliation brought on by supposed communists, Marxists, and minorities, and immigrants who are supposedly posing a threat to the character and the history of a nation. The leader proposes that only he can solve it, and all of his political opponents are enemies or traitors. Written in 2018, obviously with the experience of the first Trump regime and governments like Duterte in the Philippines or Orban in Hungary to inform this updated idea. And finally, my favorite definition by far is the definition provided by Italian literary scholar Umberto Eco in a 1995 article called Eternal Fascism, 14 Ways of Looking at a Black Shirt. By coincidence, quite easily available online and always worth the read. Umberto, who of course grew up in the 1930s and the 1940s in fascist Italy, really looks at fascism not so much as even an ideology. It's obviously not an ideology, but even sort of a defining set of principles. And he sort of argues that fascism is kind of a grab bag, a buffet of ideas that a political party can choose to take some or all of in the creation of an individual, nationally specific fascist state. But you can sort of see how some fascist states take on some of these, some don't. Some will bring some new ones in that are very sort of nationally specific, but they all sort of build towards this idea of what fascism is. And so the first is the cult of tradition. The idea that there's some past to look back to, some idealized past to look back to that can inform us of what the future should look like. So for example, Make America Great Again, or foundationalism in American constitutional law. A rejection of modernism, not a rejection of technology, but a rejection of modernism, of the ideas around modernism and the rapid change that we experience in the modern world. Really a rejection of the values of the European Enlightenment. The idea that action for action's sake is worthwhile, right? It doesn't matter. You don't need to debate. You don't need to discuss. You don't need to have policy papers. Action itself is a goal. You just need to be doing something, creating, destroying, transforming, killing. It doesn't matter. Action is the key. There's the idea that disagreement is treason, that there's only one way of seeing the world, there's only one way of existing, and anything else, any dissent, is treason and therefore punishable in the most extreme ways. A fear of difference, an idea that everyone has to be the same, that everybody in this fascist state needs to be a part of the shared national community with shared ideas. In the words or in the ideas of the German National Socialist Party of Adolf Hitler, a Volksgemeinschaft, a community of the people. An appeal to a frustrated middle class, right? The idea that it often is a result of a crisis in capitalism that destroys the middle class and creates a new inequality. An obsession with a plot, right? That any successes of the other side or failures of the fascist party are the results of some kind of plot, something nefarious, something that's being put in motion by the enemies of this true idea of the world. This weird idea that the enemies of this party, of this movement, are both too strong and too weak. An international Marxist conspiracy, but also the most desperate illegal immigrants. The idea that pacifism is defeatism, that violence, that war, that those are fundamental ways that this powerful state is built. A contempt for the weak, looking to blame the weakest, least blameworthy people in society for the fact that it's not working for the strong and for the majority. The idea that everyone can be a hero of this new movement, and that that's what you're supposed to be. You're supposed to throw yourself fully into this and become a hero in the recreation of society. A hypermasculinity, right? A disdain for women, a disdain for femininity, and a disdain for queerness. A selective populism, choosing some populist ideas but rejecting others, rejecting things like economic measures that would create equality, while embracing populist measures that would punish the weak and the othered. And then a newspeak, a creation of a new language that really sort of encapsulates these ideas and creates a new way of thinking and looking at the world. And so this definition of fascism, it's not about every fascist regime taking on all 14 of these characteristics. It's about different fascist regimes picking different ones of these that suit its own national idea and its own understanding of itself. One of the reasons, or one of the ways that this is debated today, is through the use of the term authoritarianism. You will find many people, especially on the political right and in the political center, who will embrace the idea of authoritarianism. And the idea is that Trump or Orban or any of these other regimes, they're not fascist, they're authoritarian. And authoritarian is sort of a way of saying, sure, they don't like democracy, sure, they embrace military power, but they're not as bad as those Nazis or those fascists. They're different. Now, anybody who sort of talks about this as authoritarianism, in some ways is kind of engaging in a practice of gaslighting. Because authoritarianism really is popularized in the 1970s and the 1980s by the American political and intellectual right. In fact, it's first broadly used in an essay by American political scientist Jeane Kirkpatrick, who becomes Ronald Reagan's UN ambassador. And this essay is called Dictatorships and Double Standards. And you can sort of see where it's going. And essentially, the whole point of this article was to take the far-right regimes that the United States supports during the Cold War, right, that are key parts of its anti-communist alliance, right? Say, for example, Suharto's Indonesia or Pinochet's Chile. These are clearly fascist regimes. They take on all the characteristics that Eco and others suggest of a fascist regime. But of course, if they're fascists, how can the American Cold War government of Ronald Reagan or his predecessors work in alliance with them against global communism? Because remember, this government that's in power in the 1980s, this class, this generation, this is the American greatest generation who gave up their lives in alliance with the Soviet Union to defeat fascism in Italy, Germany, and Japan. So the idea of authoritarianism then becomes a way of characterizing these governments, these regimes, that are clearly fascist, but that the United States in this Cold War period wants and needs to work with in its anti-communist crusade. And so one of the things that you're seeing, especially now, when it comes to talking about these different governments, is that they're not fascist, they're authoritarian. And what that means is that liberal democracies that believe in the capitalist global order can continue to work with them in opposition to the far left and to ideas that undermine the supremacy of capitalist economics. What does this mean for Canada? What is Canada's history of fascism? What is Canada's fascist future? Is there one? Are we, like the United States, supposedly immune to this kind of takeover of government and society? And I'd say there are definitely things about Canada that strengthen us in our opposition. We have a much stronger political and social left. That's very important. We have a much stronger social safety net that reduces some of the inequality and mitigates some of the crises of late-stage capitalism. But we do also have our own history of fascism. So, for example, in the 1930s, there were a number of political parties and political movements, some with fairly close ties to Canadian conservative parties, that engaged in and formed fascist political parties. The most notable of these is a political party led by Quebec journalist and former conservative politician Adrien Arcand. And this was the National Unity Party, created in Toronto at a meeting of fascist parties and movements at Massey Hall on July 1st, 1938. It had many characteristics of European fascist parties, of the Nazis, of the fascists in Italy. It had a uniformed militia, the blue shirts, some right-wing toughs who came together to protect this fascist meaning from the obvious left-wing disruption that resulted. And so Canada itself has this history of fascism. Of course, once Canada enters the Second World War against Germany in 1939 and Italy in 1940, these fascists are, of course, arrested and rounded up, but they don't go away. They continue to exist in Canada during the Cold War period, and as Canada ties itself more and more into Cold War anti-communism, fascists are able to re-enter public life. And so do we have a fascist party or a fascist movement in Canada today? We don't really. We do see that conservative parties, both at the federal and provincial level, are moving more and more to the extreme right. There are obvious examples of this in the policies coming out of the government of Alberta or policies being embraced by Pierre Poilievre. Do they sort of take on enough of these characteristics to be called a fascist party? I would say no. But with the rise of fascism in the United States right now, what does that mean for Canadian conservatism? What does that mean for what becomes a legitimate point of political debate? What does that mean for conservatism more broadly, which is always more comfortable minimizing fascism and working with fascist parties over working with the anti-fascist and anti-capitalist left?
That was Broadbent Institute research fellow Jon Weier on fascism for the Perspectives Journal podcast. If you like this episode, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivejournal.ca, and get more from the Broadbent Institute by subscribing to our mailing list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe.